Okay, this chapter is on ethics of climate change. Basically, it's a question of what ethical norms or ethical sense may drive action on climate change. IPCC and the assessment reports do an excellent job on the analytical part of the physical basis of climate change, the impacts, options for adaptation, mitigation, and so on. And they put out details like this. This is from NOAA, but there are many such things which list things like 10 signs of a warming world, Arctic ice, there is satellite information, ocean heat content, there is also lots of in situ data, satellite data. All of these have now basis in data, historical, instrumental, paleoclimate, and modeling. Air temperature over the ocean is increasing, sea surface temperature is increasing, global sea level is rising, air temperature over land is increasing, humidity is increasing, which is consistent with increasing temperatures over land and ocean, and increase of sea surface temperature as well. And of course, temperature of the lower atmosphere is increasing. Snow amounts and snow cover and snow extents are decreasing, and glaciers are retreating or melting. So this is kind of fingerprinting, so that if people say CO2 is not responsible for the warming, then you can use the physics of how CO2 molecules trap more energy, how CO2 isotopes can be used, oxygen measurements can be used to show that the CO2 increasing is coming from fossil fuel burning, and how that can be used to explain all these changes together and not just one or the other. Okay. Then there are information brochures put out like this. This is from the World Wildlife Fund. 10 reasons why we should all care about climate change. Are these moral persuasions? Are they ethical arguments? You have to decide for yourself. Number one is because snow leopards, turtles, and polar bears are awesome. Okay, nobody can argue with that, but what can you do beyond that? Even if you believe it, will you be able to pay a tax for reducing climate impacts? Especially when the impacts are remote, it is well known that people don't immediately identify with them, and it has turned out that the emaciated polar bears on broken icebergs are not or sea ice are not persuading people to do more than necessary, or more than what they think is their part. Because you need your morning coffee fix. So if you're one of those people who need a coffee to get going, mornings may become grim because climate change is affecting coffee and tea and everything else, as we saw, right? Because coral reefs are amazing. So there have been movies like Finding Nemo or Dory, and there are grim pictures of how the Great Barrier Reef and other corals are being decimated, and how the Western Indian Ocean corals are maybe heading towards a collapse, and so on. Because we all need clean water, plenty of evidence exists that climate change, extreme events, distribution of rainfall, changes in rainfall amounts, duration, intensity are all beginning to affect water, stream flows, groundwater, quantity, quality, and access to water as well. Because we all hate the sights of politicians in wellies. Global temperature records have been broken in recent years, and flooding in the UK gets worse. Year after year we have seen politicians wading through the floods in Somerset, hopping into dinghies in Cornwall, and arguing with each other in Westminster. More frequent and more intense extreme weather is a documented result of greenhouse gas emissions, and the annual cost of flooding in the UK could increase 15-fold by 2080s as a result of climate change. We need to see politicians taking serious action on climate change, not looking for the next photo opportunity. Again, how does this translate to action or does it drive any sense of ethical responsibility to do something? Not so obvious. Because rainforests are incredible, another argument that cannot be denied at all. Because we all deserve to breathe clean air, so there is pollution that people don't always associate with global warming necessarily, but with anthropogenic climate change driven by human-caused emissions to the atmosphere, it stands to reason that we face compromised air quality. So people confuse ozone hole with global warming, for example, but ozone hole doesn't have much to do with global warming. It's much of a emission of CFCs that caused it, and HFCs replaced the CFCs, but now HFCs are a global warming threat. Kigali Amendment is now trying to replace HFCs, but it's not as easy as one would imagine. So there are multiple complicated issues that go with clean air. Everybody wants it, but then the question of what are they willing to do for it, or what are they willing to pay for it. Because clean tech is exciting, so green technology is proposed as employment opportunities for the future, for rejigging the socioeconomics, and also producing good impacts on air quality, water quality, food production, food quality, transportation, and so on and so forth. And climate change is also being pitched as a financial risk, not just weather and climate risk. Ninth one, because we are all affected no matter where we live in, where in the world we live. So 2021 summer was a poster child for all the extreme events from the US to Europe to Africa to Asia and Australia. The question is then what happens in a couple of years if there are no similar wild and disastrous summers? How quickly do people forget? That also comes into play when it comes to taking action based on what is called recency. People remember what just happened, but they forget after a few years, or they forget what happened 10 years ago. And because of future generations. This is a difficult one because, as I've mentioned before, most people, especially the ones that get married and have children, can begin to think about saving money for their children. Even before they get married and before they have children, they start saving for college fund and so on and so forth. But does that mean they will be willing to take climate action and save the environment for their own children for the future? That's not always so obvious. So taking a leaf from another book called Bending the Curve, Mary Evelyn Tucker's chapter, she asks these questions. Is climate change not a moral challenge? We haven't defined ethics and morals yet. I will do that in a minute, but I think you have some intuitive sense about it. Who will suffer most from the effects of climate change? This becomes more about disparate climate impacts and climate justice, equality, and access to technology to protect oneself and so on, rather than just ethics. Do we have an environmental ethics that is broad enough and inclusive enough to respond, especially to the needs of the poor? So if global warming is going to create winners and losers, then will the winners care enough? Is their environmental ethics broad enough that they say, even though I'm not being hurt, I want to worry about those that are getting hurt, right? If nature is not fully valued, how can we develop a robust environmental ethics? Okay, these are the sorts of questions. So even if scientifically we prove that climate change is happening, it is because of our own actions, and the impacts are not evenly distributed, and that it is still affecting everybody, because as we said before in climate economics, even when there is a typhoon in Philippines, the supply chain is affected throughout the world, like COVID is now affecting everything. And there are also national security concerns. If there is severe weather-driven issues of governance, food security, etc. in Africa, how does it affect terrorism? If there are serious issues of climate change related food security issues in Afghanistan, how does it affect terrorism across the globe? If there is sea level rise and a country is going to face serious issues, immigration is going to become a national security issue for many countries. Already it's playing out in the Middle East, across Africa and Europe, from Europe to the US, from South America to the US, from Rohingyas to Bangladesh and India, and so on and so forth. So all these become very complicated, entangled issues, and as I said before, climate change is not always a proximal cause. It's not the immediate cause, but it tends to create these cascading effects, or it comes in and becomes some multiple stressor that tips things over and drives people to move or to fight or raise conflicts for water, for food, for resources, and so on. So ethics then becomes an entangled issue with all these sorts of socioeconomic impacts and demographic impacts. Okay?